Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. In today's tutorial, we'll be doing a continuation of the SSH series for your Raspberry Pi. In this video in particular, I'll be showing you how to SSH into your Raspberry Pi from any Wi-Fi network in the world. For those of you guys who have been following along this series, which I will link here if you haven't watched it, in the first part of the series, we showed you how to SSH into your Raspberry Pi. However, the limit was we could only SSH into our Raspberry Pi when we're connected to the same Wi-Fi as our Raspberry Pi from the device. That is, if we went outside our house and we connected to another Wi-Fi network, we would no longer have the ability to SSH into our Raspberry Pi. So in this video, I am listening to you guys in the comments and we're going to take it a step further, and I'll be showing you how to configure some parameters on your router to be able to SSH into your Raspberry Pi from any network across the world. And of course, this has much more powerful applications than just being able to do it locally. So I'll be walking you through step by step, talking to you about the parameters and what we have to do from beginning to end. And by the end of it, you will be able to control your device remotely from anywhere in the world. So trust me, just follow along, and I do not want to waste any of your time. Let's just jump straight into it. Okay, so first things first, we just want to go to our local computer, and I'm on a Mac, so I'm just going to open a terminal. But if you are on a Windows, you want to open a CMD. So I already have my terminal open, as you could see here, and we want to get the IP address of our router because we will need this parameter on the Raspberry Pi side of things to define some parameters in our config file on our Raspberry Pi to define a static IP address on our Raspberry Pi, because it is better practice to do so in this case. So first thing, we just want to type this command. So I already have it, netstat nr grep default. If you are using a Windows, the command I believe is called ipconfig. And once we type enter for this command, what we'll see is we will get the IP address of our router. Now, some different routers have some different structure. You might have the same one as me, but depending on your router, we'll discuss in a second the way you'll define your parameters on your Raspberry Pi. So just take this value you see here, keep it ready to be copied into your Raspberry Pi config, and that's pretty much the only thing we need from the terminal on our local computer. And now we're just going to jump to the Raspberry Pi side of things to show you what to define there. Okay, so now that we got the router's IP address, we can go back to our Raspberry Pi. And the first thing we want to do is we want to enable SSH. If you've been following along with this series, you probably already enabled this, I would imagine. So you just want to go to the menu there, go to Preferences, go to Raspberry Pi Configuration. Okay, give that a moment. And then we just want to go to Interfaces. We want to enable that SSH. You can see it there. It's a little small. By the way, I'm screen sharing here, but you should see SSH in the Interfaces tab. And then you just want to make sure it is toggled. And then you just want to click OK. And typically after this, you want to restart your Raspberry Pi to make sure SSH is fully enabled. Now that we have SSH enabled, next thing we want to do is we want to configure a static IP address for our Raspberry Pi on our local router. So in order to do that, we can just open a terminal. Okay. And we're going to go over this at a high level. We're not going to get too much into the network level programming because frankly, I'm not an expert and I know just enough to get it to work in this case. There are a lot of things going on here. So if you just follow along and see what I'm doing here, you will get this to work. So let's just go into a terminal here. And we just want to, first of all, sudo nano into this file. Okay. So this is the file where we will define the parameters to configure a static IP on the network. So if this is your first time in this file, you'll see that pretty much everything is commented. I added these lines right here. You could see I uncommented these and I added these lines and I added some notes for you guys. I'll link this down on my website for you guys to see this file so you don't have to copy everything here so you don't make mistakes while tagging along this video, because there are a lot of numbers and you can get a little confused. So right away, what we see in this file is we have this interface WLAN 0. So what this means is we're doing this over a Wi-Fi interface, which is what most of us want. If you are using Ethernet, you just want to use ETH0 instead of WLAN 0. So add this line. Make sure it's uncommented, obviously. Next thing we want to do is we want to define the static IP address. So in this case, I define the static IP address as this number right here, 192.168.1.100. Now, one thing you have to do when you define a static IP address is you have to make sure it does not conflict with other static IPs on your network. This is a really safe one to use. In most cases, you can probably use this one if you have the same router subnets as I do. So we'll talk about that in a second here. So just going down here, you see the static routers equals 192.168.1.1 0.254, that's exactly the number we got from our local computer when we ran that command line command. It gave us the IP address of our router. This is exactly that there. Now, one thing I note here, so this is, I just want to be really clear about this. One thing I note is that be sure to check your router IP, okay? So first of all, we talked about the two commands you could run, one for Windows, one for Mac. However, in a lot of cases, what you'll see is your router's IP will be different than the one I had. So in my case, mine was 192.168.1.254. Some people, you will see 192.168.0.1. And if you have a router IP like this, you can't use this IP address for your static IP of your Raspberry Pi, because this would have to be a 0 instead of a 1 for it to fall within the same subnet mask as your router IP. So just keep that in mind. If your router's IP address has a 0 right here, just know you would have to toggle this to a 0 in order to get this to work, because the IP address of your Raspberry Pi has to fall within the same subnet mask of your router. So that's just a high level thing there. And of course, you can even have other types of IP addresses for your router. However, those are very peculiar cases we're not going to go into. These three are probably the most common. If you're having other issues, just let me know in the comment section down below, okay? And finally, what we do here is we have the static domain name server, and we just set it equal to this, same as our router's IP address, followed by 8.8.8.8. And once we have all that, make sure it's uncommented as I mentioned. And of course, one last thing before we exit this file is this does not have to be 0.100. It just has to be a value between 0 and 255. 100 is just a safe value because there's a high chance it's not conflicting with other devices on your network, okay? So in order to exit this, we can just do Control X. And if you did modify that file, it's going to ask you to save it, and you can just click yes or Y and click enter. And so finally, once we configure that, we have to one more time reboot our Raspberry Pi. So you could just do sudo reboot in the terminal. And you should have everything on the Raspberry Pi side of things to have configured where you can actually SSH into this static IP address. So now that we have that, we're actually going to go into our router itself on our router dashboard on our computer and configure some parameters to be able to set up port forwarding onto the static IP address we just set up. Okay, so now that we configured the parameters on our Raspberry Pi, we just want to jump back to our local computer and make sure we're connected to the Wi-Fi that is the same Wi-Fi as the Raspberry Pi. You only have to do this to set things up. Really, after you do all this, you do not have to use your local network anymore. So I'm not trying to finagle you. We just have to do this to set up port forwarding, and then the magic will happen. So let's just go to a browser and type in the static IP address of your Raspberry Pi, or your router, sorry, I should say. And we can just see that mine is already here because I already went to this before. And we could just go ahead and click enter. And this will take us to the router dashboard where we can configure a bunch of router parameters. Now, there's a high chance you've never seen this, so we're going to go over a very specific thing. We're just going to enable port forwarding to the Raspberry Pi on that static IP we set up. However, if you are using a provider that's different from AT&T, of course, your dashboard will be a little different. So just try to follow along as best as possible. Really, the premise is the same. So we just want to go to the firewall tab on our AT&T dashboard. Sorry if you're using a provider where the dashboard looks really different. So just try to follow along as best as possible. I really couldn't generalize this to everyone's configuration because, of course, everyone has different internet providers. So let's go to the firewall tab, go to NAT Gaming. So hopefully if you're using something else, you can find that NAT Gaming tab. And you can see right away, it's asking for this device access code. Now, this is not your internet password. This is the device access code on your router. So just go to your router. It should be on the side, and you should be able to get it here if you're using AT&T. However, if you are using another provider, I do not know what they will ask for. So you can see I already entered it, and I could just go ahead and click continue. And once we are there, we're in this NAT Gaming dashboard. Okay, so we just want to create a new service that will allow us to port forward into the SSH port on the Raspberry Pi. So we just go down there and click custom services, and we just want to create this service name. So the service name, we'll call it Raspberry Pi SSH. You can see I played around with this from before, and we'll just call it Raspberry Pi SSH 3.0. And we want this global port range to be 222. Now, I'm not going to get too much into this value here, but the base port should be 22. And the reason we're making the global port range different than the base port is we're trying to do something called changing the default port. So this is just good security practice to do this sort of thing when you are SSHing or enabling SSH across the internet on your device. So you want to obfuscate the real port, which in this case is 22, with a different port, which in our case, we just set it as 2222. So that's just a random port we set for security purposes. And we're going to use that port to forward into the Raspberry Pi. Now we have this protocol here. You do not have to change it. It is TCP UDP. There are some other protocols. Actually, there aren't, but this is fine. We'll just keep it as is. And we'll just go ahead and click add once that is done. Okay, so now we added that. Now we can return to the NAT gaming dashboard. So we're almost done here. And you can see right away that it has this service needed by device Raspberry Pi. So of course you can go here. There are a bunch of devices on your network. Make sure you select your Raspberry Pi and the service. So the service we just created, as you saw, it's right there. And we could just go ahead and click add. Okay, so now we did everything on the router side of things to be able to do this. Now there's just one more step we'll go over. We just need the public IP address of our router on the internet so anyone can find or use that IP address to SSH into our Raspberry Pi. Okay, so now that we configured everything on our router side, we can just go to whatismyipaddress.com, and I'm just obfuscating these so you don't see my public IP address, but really we just want to keep this IP address IPv4 at hand. Yours will be unique to you. And this is the IP address we're going to use to SSH into our Raspberry Pi. So just copy that. And now let's jump into the terminal on our Raspberry Pi, on our local computer actually, to show you that this works as expected. Okay, so now that we configured everything properly, we should be able to open a terminal or CMD on your local computer or whatever device you want to SSH into your Raspberry Pi from. So I have one here. We're about to SSH, but before we do that, we have to make sure to switch networks to prove that it works. So originally I was on the same network as my Raspberry Pi, but now of course the whole premise of this video was to be able to SSH from external networks. So we're just going to switch to another network, which in this case is just the hotspot on my phone. So luckily I have a hotspot ready. If you do not, just go to a cafe or somewhere else to prove that this works. So we just switch. I'm gonna give it a brief moment because something I notice is when we switch right away, I have some network issues on my end. So I'm just gonna give it 10 seconds and we'll hop back into this terminal. Okay, so I just gave my device some time to switch properly to my hotspot. I notice it's a little weird when I switch to my hotspot, and sometimes it denies me access to my Raspberry Pi at the beginning. But now that we have that ready to go, we can just go ahead and just use the SSH command to SSH into our Raspberry Pi. So we have SSH, the name of your username on your Raspberry Pi, so whatever you use regularly to SSH or log into your device, and at your public IP address. So this is the IP address we got from that whatismyipaddress.com. And finally, we have -P2222, which is what we define on the router side of things to port forward into port 22 on the Raspberry Pi. So my Raspberry Pi is on in the back of me on a different network, and you can see once again I am on that hotspot, and I'm just going to go ahead and click enter here. And so it's going to ask for my password. So same password you use to sign into your Raspberry Pi. And hopefully you can see right away that it worked, and we could just go ahead and type commands as we would regularly on an SSH shell. So now we have the ability to control our Raspberry Pi from anywhere, so that is pretty cool. Okay, so that pretty much sums it up for this video, guys. You saw that I was able to SSH into my Raspberry Pi from an external network. I hope you were able to as well. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel if you learned something new or I made your life easier. If you are still having issues, I know we went over a lot in this video and it was much more involved than the first couple tutorials on this series. So let me know in the comment section down below. I will do my best to help you, but I am not a network programming expert, so I'll try my best with the resources I have. But hopefully everything I showed you in this video was enough to get you past the finish line and to be able to control your Raspberry Pi from a distance using SSH across any network. Stay tuned, guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial.